Invincible is making a lot of changes from the comics this season, and I'm all for most of them. This episode is loaded with changes, and honestly might be my favorite so far. So let's get right into the comic comparisons. Episode 5, Give Us a Moment. The title comes from the comics when Nolan asks Mark and Oliver to give him and Debbie a moment alone. This episode starts off with Nolan and Allan showing up to Earth, and there are a few interactions we never got to see in the comics. The first new interaction is Allan showing off his alien pet to Eve, and no, it's not like Nolan's pets. Allan also vouches for Nolan being a changed man, which is always good to see. I love their friendship. Then we get a one-on-one conversation between Mark and his dad. Mark only agrees to help against the Viltrumites because they will always be a threat to Earth. This next interaction did occur in the comics, but it was very different. Nolan and Debbie's reunion. Oh boy. Going into this, Nolan was expecting Debbie to be happier.
I think he expected my mom to be happier to see him.
Why would he expect that?
Mark tells him that seeing her is selfish, since it will only hurt her, and he only wants to apologize to make himself feel better. Nolan almost knocks on the door, but decides to walk away because of what Mark said. But Debbie opens the door and Nolan goes in. Their conversation was so much better in the show. I think this was the best change of the episode. I've been wondering how this would go, and it went so well. In the comics, Debbie doesn't forgive Nolan right here either, but their confrontation was way less argumentative. They talk a lot more, both of them expressing how they feel. Nolan says that he's no longer a Viltrumite and that Debbie made him a human, but Debbie says he's barely a bad photocopy of a human. In the comics, he comes in unexpectedly, and all that happens is he apologizes, saying that he has changed, and she says she doesn't know if she'll ever believe him. She was more competitive in this show, and I think I speak for everyone when I say, good for you, Debbie. One of the greatest character improvements from the comics. The last interaction we got on Earth that wasn't in the comics is Nolan and Art, who were good friends before the events of Season 1. Nolan goes to Art to share a six-pack just like the old times, although it's clear that Art wants nothing to do with him.
I am sorry about everything.
Dismissing his apology and telling him he won't make his suits anymore since he only makes hero costumes. I think Art knew how risky it was to say that to him, because once Nolan leaves, Art looks like he was holding in a panic attack. And you've got to have some respect for Art for standing on business here. His character in the show is so much better. His comic version is way more forgiving of Omni-Man. One interaction that happened in the comics, but not the show, was Nolan and Oliver. They have a private conversation where Nolan decides to bring Oliver along for the war in order to get to know him better. However, in the show, it was the opposite. It was Mark and Debbie who decided to let Oliver go, and Nolan was mad, saying he didn't want to corrupt his son. I mean, Oliver is literally only 2 years old. Is war really for babies? I know, he's actually like 15, 16 because of his Thraxan DNA, but that is still a kid who should not be going to war. Speaking of, Tech Jacket is a literal child as well. How are you going to recruit 2 children to fight against the strongest empire in the galaxy? Tech Jacket is another big change from the comics. First of all, in the comics, Allan and Nolan both went to get him. However, in the show, it was only Allan that was sent, while Nolan was speaking to Debbie. They also gender swapped Zach Thompson for Zoe Thompson. The thing is, I've never read the Tech Jacket comics, so I only know him from the few times he's in the main Invincible comics, and from what I know, she seems to have a similar personality. If you're a fan of the Tech Jacket comics, let me know how you feel about this change in the comments. Before they head off to space, Mark and Eve have a little talk that's slightly different in the comics. Mark is the one to bring up how he might not come back from the war, and Eve tells him to shut up and not to talk about it. But in the show, Eve asks him not to die, and he promises not to. Then as they're leaving, Mark and Oliver even say goodbye to Paul, with Oliver giving him a hug and Mark shaking his hand. Really make me think that Paul is going to have a bigger role in the story. They even had a last meal as a family. And I mean, I kind of like him. I really hope they don't just make him a jerk out of nowhere later on just to get rid of him. Then Oliver asks Mark how to breathe in space.
Mark, how do we breathe in space?
That's the neat thing.
And Mark replies the same way his father did back in Season 1 when he asked the same question.
How do I breathe in space?
That's the neat thing. You don't.
Comic Nolan actually gets mad at Mark for not teaching Oliver earlier about holding their breath in space. About halfway through the episode, they leave Earth for Telescria, which is the home base of the Coalition of Planets. Along this trip, we see Nolan struggling to fit in with everyone, having both his sons basically ignore him. Oliver looked up to Omni-Man in the comics, but in the show, he seems to be mad at his dad for now. Then Conquest and 2 other Viltrumites attack them, destroying most of the ship. The Conquest rematch happens slightly differently. First of all, Conquest talks a lot more in the comics. He slaps Oliver in the same way as in the show, but instead of squishing Oliver's head, he was doing that to Nolan. And Nolan had no words. He just looked terrified. Mark even comes in to help him. In the original Conquest fight, Conquest never opened up to Mark here, telling him about how lonely he was. So the comics never had this funny interaction.
You gotta tell me all your deepest feelings again?
That was in confidence.
Mark rage baiting one of the strongest Viltrumites is actually crazy. During this fight, Nolan is proud of Oliver for fighting so well, but in the show, they aren't getting along, so Oliver tells him he doesn't need his help. Look at what Lucan was about to hit you with, Oliver. The Viltrumite slice. Your father just saved your life. Although he does accept his help whenever he loses his breath later on, and he flies to the nearest planet, with Conquest deciding to follow, wanting to hurt Mark the same way he did last season with Eve. And just look at this image here, the size difference. The joy on Conquest's face. The ignorance on Oliver's face. Luckily, Mark was right there to save him because there's no way Oliver would have survived. And this is where things get really disturbing. Mark puts his hands around Conquest's throat and says he'll never breathe again.
You're never breathing again.
And that is the last thing said between them. But the comics had a lot more dialogue, and I'm really not sure which version I like better. I think the dialogue fits the comics, but the silence and just hearing the struggle between those two in the show was so brutal. Also in the comics, Mark never bit his finger off. Mark doesn't let go until Conquest is done for good this time. Mark won, but not without great injury to himself. Nolan and Oliver show up in shock, just like in the comics. Then the episode ends with one more change. When Thetis hears what happened to the ship and that almost everyone is missing in action, he actually reacts calmly, saying he believes in their strength and their ability to make it back to the fight. But in the comics, he gets angry and flips out. In conclusion, this episode took the comic material and really changed it up for the better. Debbie and Nolan's reunion and Mark's rematch with Conquest were so good. Let me know anything you thought the comics did better, and just your thoughts on the episode overall. And again, just thanks for watching.